Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rabbi Jarrod Grover. I'm the senior rabbi of Beth Tikva Synagogue, and very pleased to welcome you all to this special program. Before I introduce our special guest, just want to remind you all of a couple of Zoom protocols. I believe that Gail is going to be managing mute and unmute, but if you accidentally see yourself going on to unmute, it's been known to happen. Remember, we can hear everything, whether you're whispering or not, that's going on if your microphone is on. So you want to guard that and make sure that you're muted. And towards the end of today's interview, the session should last about an hour, and maybe we'll dedicate the last 15 or 20 minutes to some questions from the audience. And Gail is going to be fielding those questions, which you can send to her using the chat dialogue. So if you, let me see, where's Gail? Gail, where are you? Can you unmute yourself, Gail?
Yes. Hi.
And say hello.
Hi, everyone.
Can we see you?
Yes, if you put me in
Okay,
speaker and gallery view.
Gail is going to be moderating. And if you send a message in the chat box, either to her or to everyone, she'll see it and she'll be able to help gather those questions, fill them into themes, and maybe explore some other topics that I don't have time to cover as I interview Lauren. This session is being recorded, and it might be distributed or put on the internet in case someone was busy this afternoon and wants to watch the interview. So if you are a shy person and don't want your face to be out there distributed on the internet, I always remind people you have the option to turn your cameras off, and then you'll just be stuck with me and with Lauren. And if you're more comfortable with that, you're free to do so. So 1 year ago, I was in Israel on an Israel bonds mission, and nobody knew anything about viruses there, or so I thought. My taxi driver who picked me up from Ben Gurion Airport knew everything about the virus, and Israeli taxi drivers talk and talk and talk. And I didn't take it too seriously when he was telling me what Israel was going to be bracing for, particularly the tourism industry. He was concerned about that. And I look back a year later, and the lesson is don't ignore what your Israeli cab driver tells you about the future. They're smarter than you think. And I think that this year it is really, really important for us in the American and Canadian Jewish communities who feel particularly disconnected from events in Israel, disconnected in a way that I can't remember in my lifetime, because of the cessation of tourism, the stopping of traffic. We've got to make an extra effort to understand what's going on in Israel and to remain connected. And I want to thank our Israel Affairs Committee and the Adult Education Committee of Beth Tikva, who listened to my feelings on that and recommended that we bring in Lauren today, and have been recommending actually a slew of programs. I get too many emails from them saying, we got to do this, we got to do that. Here are some great programs, and they're all fantastic. And so this program is really both to meet Lauren, celebrate her achievements, get her perspective on things in Israel, but it's also to connect us because we feel so disconnected from Israel right now. So a big thank you to Adult Education and to our Israel Affairs Committee for helping make this possible. And Lauren, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. For those who don't know Lauren Izso is a TV host, international news reporter, and a journalist based in Tel Aviv. She was born in Toronto, studied at the University of British Columbia, Ryerson's School of Journalism, and Tel Aviv University, where she studied part-time as she built her experience as a TV journalist at the Israel-based international news channel I-24 News. She hosted a weekly documentary show called High Definition with Lauren Izso and reporting on breaking news stories. Lauren moved to Israel in 2012, and before I-24 News, she was an intern at the Jerusalem Post and eventually hosted the J Post TV News. Since leaving I-24 in 2019, Lauren has done a variety of freelance news, including producing 3 Israeli elections with CNN, soon to be
Almost 4,
4,
almost
right?
4.
Soon to be 4, reporting for the CBC, TRT, RT, and Newsmax. Also keeping up in print, Lauren has recently written for the Allgemeiner, Israel 21C, and she did investigative reporting for the Jerusalem Post. In the last few months, she has returned to reporting local Israeli news, hosting ILTV's Israel Daily News twice a week, hosting conferences, and reporting for international networks on big breaking stories. And a bit of Beth Tikva history is that Lauren's parents were married at Beth Tikva on June 21st, 1981. Lauren, it's so good to
Wow.
have you with us. How's the weather in Tel Aviv?
It's actually not so bad. I'm really happy to be with you guys as well. There was a big snowstorm in Jerusalem over the weekend. I'm sure you guys saw pictures of it, and it was really, really rainy and windy in Tel Aviv. Like I couldn't leave my apartment for 24 hours. And today was just a beautiful day and the sun was out. And a lot of people were actually at the beach, believe it or not.
Wow, what must that be like, the beach? We're very
Going
jealous.
to the beach this time of year. Yeah, I'm sure you are.
So we're very jealous of that. That's an additional way we feel very disconnected. The winter makes us feel even more disconnected from Israel. So Lauren, why don't you, before we get into the topics, that there's a few things I want to talk to you about, the big issues, the virus, the upcoming Israeli elections. Why don't we start with you telling us a bit about yourself, about your career? Give us a chance to get to know you, why journalism is interesting for you, what motivates you in your work day to day.
Sure. Well, after your whole long speech, I'm not sure how much I can add to that, but I will try. So if you want me to go all the way back, I actually, as a child growing up and then as a teenager, I was really passionate about acting and theater. That was what I had always planned on going into. And I sort of saw myself having a future career as an actress or something in theater, something to do with that. And when I finished high school, I wasn't sure whether or not that was really something that was realistic to pursue. So I wound up doing a sort of general year at UBC in Vancouver. And from being there, I decided that journalism was something that was going to really fit me because, first of all, I always considered myself a storyteller, which is sort of that, played into acting as well. And I could also use that performance aspect that I was trained in acting. And I had planned eventually to do TV news, to present TV news, but obviously you have to start somewhere like a little bit lower before you're going to be sitting, in that chair in the studio. So I decided to apply for journalism school at Ryerson University. And I studied there for 2 years, which was a really, really amazing experience because everything's really hands-on there. Like, I think the first class that I did in the journalism program was, here's a story that's really happening. Like, go, you have 4 hours to write a story and submit it by 6 o'clock. So we were just sort of thrown into it and I loved it right from the start. So I was at Ryerson for 2 years. And then as part of the program, you have to do an internship in journalism, of course. So I figured, since I have so many family connections to Israel, and it's a place where a lot of news happens, it would probably be a good place for me to do my internship. So I applied to do the internship at the Jerusalem Post and I got it. And I came to Israel for what I planned to be a 2-month trip. And now I've been here 8.5 years.
Wow.
Yeah. So from there, from being an intern, I was a breaking news editor when I started to work there full time. And then I launched with them their J Post TV News, which was the first time the Jerusalem Post had sort of done any kind of TV news broadcast. So I got to build that from the ground up, which was really exciting for me, especially because I'd never done anything like that before. So I was able to learn a lot about TV journalism and also learn a lot about building it. So I was learning from in front of the camera and behind the camera, which was really fun. And from that, I knew that I wanted to take TV a little bit more seriously. So I-24 opened up, which was like, seemed the perfect place for me because it was the only 24-hour English news channel in the country. So I applied there, I got a job there. And I was hired at first as a security reporter on the weekly defense show. So I wasn't on camera at all at the beginning. Until a few months in, I started doing a few reports here and there, and then it sort of, spiraled, and I started hosting breaking news, going out to report on big news stories for the channel. I think a year and a half into me working at I-24, I started hosting High Definition with Lauren Izso. It was like a weekly documentary program where we did really interesting human interest pieces. We got to do a lot of original documentaries, as well as we bought from Israeli directors from the outside. And I was able to, through that show, really learn a lot about Israeli society and maybe parts of Israeli society that I had never submerged myself in before. So that was a really, really good experience for me. I worked there in the end for 4.5 years, which is a really long time. But I got a lot of my firsts there. It really, really taught me how to be a journalist. I always tell people that I-24 is the best journalism school they ever went to, but don't tell that to Ryerson.
Yeah, when I'm in Israel and I'm watching these reporters, as I click through the channels, there's nothing like it in North America. The way these reporters get yelled at and get into arguments on TV, you really get pushed into the fire when you want to be on television and take any particular point of view on any subject in Israel. You're going to be in big, big trouble with someone.
Definitely, but especially with the Hebrew news. Like in English, it's usually
More
Westerners,
civilized,
English
right.
speakers, Canadians, Americans. But if you turn on channel 12, watch the 8 o'clock news, there's probably like 6 analysts sitting in the studio and everybody's yelling at the same time, trying to be louder and be louder than
right.
the one beside them. And it's really frustrating to watch Israeli television.
Okay, so you're bringing a bit of civility into Israeli news.
I'm trying to.
Okay. North American civility into the chaos. Very good.
Yeah, and just to catch you up a little bit of what I did since I left I-24. So as you said, I produced sort of big events with CNN. I produced all the elections for them, and I'm about to do another one with them, either in the field or in the studio that they bring in a studio from Abu Dhabi and build it for every election, which is really amazing to be a part of. Wow. I also do reporting on breaking news for TRT, which is a Turkish network, and RT, which is a Russian channel. And I do some reporting for CBC, mostly radio reporting for CBC. And now, as you said, I'm working at ILTV, hosting twice a week the Israel Daily News, which I just came from doing right now. So you guys can watch it tonight. It airs on Canadian television. If you want to ask my mom, she can tell you exactly where to watch it. And of course, since COVID, a lot of conference events that big organizations are putting on have now been transferred to TV studios. So I've been called a lot recently to host television conferences, which is something quite new for me, but different and exciting because I get to interview experts about things I wouldn't get to interview them about normally, like really in depth, and learn about things I would not normally learn about on the news. So that's been different and fun. And yeah, as a freelancer, sort of whoever calls, I try to fit it into my schedule. Every week is different for me. That's the truth.
So it sounds like we picked the right person to interview today because over the course of, you said it was 8.5 years of you living in Israel, you've really gotten to understand the country, its complexities, and you probably at this point could not imagine yourself reporting from anywhere else in the world, at least not with the same amount of depth of knowledge that you've acquired living in Israel. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say. And I think that the news in Israel is a different animal. It's a story here that has been ongoing for so many years and so many people around the world are so invested in. It's an important story. And I'm not sure that I would feel, I'm sure journalism is always an important job, no matter where you are and what you're reporting about. But in Israel, I feel it's sort of on a different level. There's so many people that are reporting news in ways that is maybe untrue or biased in certain ways. And here especially, It is so important to tell the story in the right way.
Yeah, so a couple of weeks ago, we talked about that, you and I, about bias in the media. And you shared with me some thoughts that are interesting. I wonder if you could share them now with the groups. And I said, Lauren, you're reporting for the CBC. We've had a lot of challenges in the Jewish community trying to get unbiased reporting on Israel from the CBC and many other networks. Tell me about your sense of whether reporting from Israel has challenges to the ideas that you learned maybe in journalism school about objective reporting, or whether you feel that the media today is doing a better job at keeping coverage neutral.
Well, first of all, I think that no media outlet can be completely unbiased. I just don't think that's possible, because every media outlet has somebody at the top that's paying the bills that has a political view. It's just something you can't avoid. And especially as a freelancer, like I told you in our conversation a few weeks ago, sometimes people want you to skew the way you're reporting for a certain audience or for a certain person that's paying your bills. But as a journalist, the biggest challenge is to sort of weed through that and still report the story, report the facts, remembering who your audience is and reporting it in the right way, but not changing the story for them. In terms of Canadian media specifically, so as I said, I'm a freelancer. I was never a correspondent for any Canadian media outlet. For CBC, I've done work here and there, and I know that I've heard stories about Canadian media being maybe biased against Israel. But from my personal experiences working with CBC, I didn't feel that. In my personal work and the editors that I was working with on my reports, I didn't feel that. But who knows, maybe if I was hired as a full-time correspondent, my answer would be a little bit different. I'm not sure.
So I want to just play with this idea for a little bit. You said every media agency has somebody at the top that wants you to take a particular position. But on the other hand, as a reporter, you've got to remain objective. So which one is it? How do you, do you feel the breath of whoever that personality is at the top who's pushing you to report the story in a particular way?
So I would say the biggest way that I feel that is with terminology, because terminology has a lot of power in a story. The words you're choosing change the perspective of the story. So for example, I won't be specific, but there's certain networks that I report from occasionally that I have to say the occupied West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem.
Right.
And I'm sure a lot of people watching are like, oh my gosh, like how could you agree to say something like that? But it's just the nature of my work, depending on who is watching that channel and what vocabulary, what rhetoric is acceptable in their community. You can still tell the story in the right way and still tell the facts, but sometimes you have to change some of the terminology, and that's just the reality of the work and the situation.
That's so interesting. A cautionary note for everybody when they're reading reporting from the Middle East. It is often about terminology. So many complaints that the Jewish community has had, or the pro-Israel community has had with journalism in the way it reports about Israel, is specifically about terminology. When the word freedom fighter is used, when the word terrorists are used, when they use the word settler instead of Israeli. And you're saying you do feel like, depending on who you're reporting for, you have to be very careful about which terms you use, even though it may not change the facts on the ground.
It's not necessarily even about being careful. Like some networks have rules about this.
Wow.
Like they will make you redo your report if you're not calling something the way that they think it's supposed to be called.
So one can report the same exact story and have the basic facts align, but skew people's perspectives because of the words and language that you're using. Very, very interesting.
I mean, a very extreme example, of course, would be watching CNN versus watching Fox. Realistically, right. They're telling the same story, but the way they're telling it is completely changing the way that you're absorbing it, right?
Yes. And yet you say that your experience so far in journalism, you've gotten a lot of respect from executives and producers, and they've been relatively hands off in accepting and reviewing your reports. Is that correct?
From CBC, you're referring to?
Just in general.
In general, I mean, of course, it depends specifically which editor I'm working with at any given time. But generally, I like to put enough effort into my work that I know that the way I'm reporting it is going to be the best way possible for that given report or job. And I haven't, in my experience, gotten too much pushback. I'm sure other people have, depending on maybe how much they're letting their own personal views get in the way of how they're reporting the story, something like that. Every journalist is different, of course. But no, I haven't had crazy pushback.
Something I hear a lot from people is that Israel has a PR problem. What do you think? What do you think about people who say that? Or what do you think about that opinion?
That can you be more specific that Israel's a PR problem, meaning that the media
Whenever there's a conflict,
Yeah,
Israel
yeah.
fails to get the message out to justify what they're doing, what position they're taking, versus the Palestinians who seem to have a much better case when they go in front of the international media, and they're able to sell their story much more effectively than the IDF or the government.
I think it goes both ways. I mean, I think that people are sympathetic to Israel and people are sympathetic to the Palestinians, and that changes. It's a very fluid situation. I think actually, I would say the opposite. I would say that Israel is really, really good at PR. I mean, when you're talking about the UN Human Rights Council or the ICC, like that is a completely sort of separate animal. But in general, Israel has the most well-functioning PR machine, I would say, definitely in the Middle East, maybe in the entire world. Israel is really, really, really good at not manipulating stories, but they're really good at getting the message out that they want, let's say.
You've never had any concern when you need to speak to an IDF spokesperson or anyone from the government that the people they're sending to you to tell the story, or at least the government side of the story, that they're unequipped. For you, you're impressed with who they're sending forward.
I would say that the end of the story that you're getting is from the journalist's end, from the media end, not from the sources. So however that journalist or that media outlet is, taking the story and changing it to give to the audience, wouldn't you say that's on them, not the sources?
Right, it's true. And you've got to do your best always to remain objective, no matter who they're sending you.
Absolutely.
To tell the story. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this fascinating year, if you could call it that, of reporting. Israel has been one of the countries at the center of this pandemic, both because for a bad reason and for a good reason, because of the incredibly quick rate of spread and its vulnerability to the virus, and now, thankfully, for its successes in its vaccination program. So tell us a little bit about where things are now in terms of the first issue, that is the lockdowns and the virus spread. How do you assess where Israel is at the end of February 2021?
So
or I should say Purim 1 year later.
I'm sure you're all reading in the news about how Israel is leading the world in its vaccine campaign. So many people have been vaccinated that today we opened up a lot of things in the country for people with green passports, meaning they have been vaccinated. It's a certificate you get 7 days after your second vaccine. And as of today, that will get you into gyms, hotels, in a few weeks, maybe even on flights, movie theaters, shows, concerts, anything you want, you will be able to only get in with a green passport. Still today, they're opening malls and street stores and some other things for anyone, for everyone that wants to go, not only vaccinated people. But basically, Israel is showing the world that the vaccine is working and it's possible to come out of this eventually. Like, I can't even believe that we're about to sort of do this experiment of like going back to normal life and being able to hang out with a lot of people at the same time and have events and all these kinds of crazy things while you guys are, essentially still in lockdown. It's hard to believe that we're the guinea pigs of the world in terms of this. And so many people have been vaccinated. There are vaccine clinics all over the country. They're now, maybe you guys have heard, they're giving incentives to get vaccinated. So they had a vaccine center in Bnei Brak, I believe, where they were giving out cholent to all the people that were coming there to get vaccinated. In Jaffa, not far from my house, they had a vaccine center where they were giving everyone knafe and pizza and coffee. And just over the weekend, there was like a bar in Tel Aviv that was giving everyone that got the vaccine a beer.
Wow.
So, like I said, Israel's really good at PR. It's become this sort of fun vaccine campaign. Everybody wants to do it. It's something everybody celebrates. Because of that, we've vaccinated a ton of our population. And we're beginning to hopefully see the light at the end of the tunnel, even though a few months down the line, nobody really knows what's going to happen.
Just before we get to the vaccines, I mean, but yes, that's the good story, but Israel's rate of spread has also been very, very high.
That's true.
And part of the reason for that, from what I understand, is because of certain communities in Israel, particularly the ultra-Orthodox community and the Palestinian community, who
Right.
have not taken some of the health precautions seriously. Is your feeling that this pandemic has maybe further increased divisions in Israeli society because there's frustration with segments of society that didn't take the restrictions seriously and therefore caused these multiple lockdowns to prolong in the first place?
I think you have to separate the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab communities into different categories because there's sort of different reasons behind their high infection rates and low vaccinations. So in the Arab community, it's essentially more about a lack of education and a lack of information. They just don't know a lot about it. And so the general feeling is something we don't know too much about scares us, so we're going to stay away from it.
Mhm.
If you go to the vaccine clinics in Arab communities, they're empty. Nobody knows whether or not they want to do it. Nobody really understands if it's good or not. In the ultra-Orthodox communities, they have leaders actively telling them, some not to get vaccinated, some that it's okay to have weddings. There was footage from a couple of weeks ago of like a funeral with 10,000 people there for a rabbi that had died of COVID. So it seems like the information there is just backwards. They're getting the wrong information. I just was hearing a story on the news a couple of days ago about an older woman who listened to her rabbi, and because of what he said, she got her first vaccine and then refused to get her second one, like an old sickly woman. So it's a big responsibility for the leaders of these communities to give their, the people in their communities the right information. I'm not sure if what you asked is true, that it's dividing the society. I think that seeing these images on the news of these, funerals with 10,000 people and these weddings, yeah, it makes people angry. But at the end of the day, we're not at war with each other. That's not what this is. We are struggling through a really, really big crisis, and we want to get out of it the best way we can. So I wouldn't say there's anger or animosity. It's more like disappointment and everybody wanting everybody to work together on this and for us to be able to come out of it okay.
And is the anger, okay, so it's disappointment, but is there anger at the government for not doing enough to stop these mega funerals from taking place and to make sure that Israeli Arabs are incentivized in some way to get these vaccinations? Because unless you get a certain percentage, right, my understanding is unless you get a certain percentage of the population to take the vaccine, this is just going to be an ongoing problem. And that means everybody.
So yes, there is anger at the government, but that's not something that's new. And it's not something that just, like came from COVID.
There's always anger at the government. That's a good point.
First of all, yes, there's always anger in the government. But first of all, specifically with those issues, the amount they're getting involved in Arab communities, not only with police and security there, but with education. And also, we have an election coming up, and Netanyahu wants to make a right-wing government. And to do that, he needs the ultra-Orthodox parties to be in his coalition and to agree with him and to partner with him. And if he's going to start making rules saying the Haredim can't do what they want, the ultra-Orthodox, you can't do this, you can't do that, they're not going to want to be his friend when the elections come around. And that's
Right.
a big problem for him because he's also facing corruption charges, and there's a lot at stake for Netanyahu right now. So yeah, the government is a huge, huge, huge mess, and it's not helping the situation. But I don't think that's something that came from COVID.
And I mean, some of my more secular friends in Israel are saying the problem is that the pandemic in Israel has become very, very politicized. And the decisions that the government is making take into account things like who's going to form the next coalition in the government, and we have to base the restrictions we impose on society based on election outcomes. Is that
Right.
you
Isn't
agree
that
with that?
insane? But it's absolutely true. You can't even deny it, because every time there's supposed to be a vote about easing some restrictions or changing anything, the vote is delayed 3 days because this person can't agree with this person, and this person doesn't want to, make this person angry. So nobody makes a decision and everything gets postponed again.
Right.
Happens literally once a week.
Right. So vaccinations are no country could better deserve the vaccinations than Israel. At least it'll help, hopefully, begin to untangle this public health / political discomfort in the country right now. So I want you to just say clearly to the 112 screens we have on this call, because
Is that how many there are? Wow.
I've got 112 screens. But I think we ought to be very clear on this point. Are Israelis, is the Israeli government ensuring that all Israelis, Palestinian and Jewish, have access to vaccines?
Absolutely. In fact, you don't even have to be an Israeli citizen to get a vaccine. If you live in Israel, there's a vaccine clinic they opened about 10-minute drive from my house. All you need is a passport to go there, and they will vaccinate you for free. You don't even need an appointment. You just have to show up and they will give you the jab.
A passport from any country?
It's actually, the program was made for asylum seekers and refugees, but they opened it up to everybody.
Makes me think we should try and get a flight together and apply as a refugees.
I'm trying to convince my mom.
There's actually an interesting question about whether Israel should be doing more. I know it's a complicated question, but about whether Israel should be doing more now that it has its vaccination program under control, or it's going to be in the next few weeks, whether Israel could play a role in helping Jewish communities elsewhere in the world in their vaccination programs. But I'm not sure if that would open up a whole can of worms.
It definitely would. There was actually an organization a few months ago that wanted to distribute vaccines from Israel to Holocaust survivors all over the world. And actually, the Jewish agency became really angry with them for even suggesting it, because they don't want to intervene in other countries' vaccine programs, and they don't want to get involved in politics. So I'm not sure that will be an option, but Israel's already talking about medical tourism for vaccines. So who knows, maybe it's just a matter of time until you guys can buy like a vaccine trip to Israel and come get vaccinated before you can even get access to it in Canada.
So Israel's talking about tourism for vaccines. That means Israel is open to the idea that foreigners will come into Israel and be able to get their vaccines there and then leave.
Well, there's a big difference between talking about it and actually doing it. As we just talked about, the infighting in the government stops a lot of these kinds of things from happening. So we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, they're talking about it. And,
one way to help the Israeli economy recover, right?
Right. That's what I'm saying. We have so many vaccines, and we're going to throw them away. We have to vaccinate people.
Wow. We are jealous of that storyline.
I wish I could
Canada.
invite you all to come and get vaccinated. Really.
So, and Palestinians who are living in Gaza and the West Bank, could you tell us a bit about their eligibility for vaccines?
Sure. So legally, under the Oslo Accords, Israel is not required to give medical support to the Palestinians, to the Palestinian Authority or Hamas, Gaza, the West Bank. But Israel actually did offer them initially help with the vaccines, and they had refused that help, saying that they were going to get vaccines from other places like Russia, like China, the UN, different humanitarian organizations. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank did get some vaccines, not too many. I think the number is in the thousands. Israel just announced, I believe yesterday, that they will vaccinate 100,000 Palestinian workers that are coming from the West Bank into Israel. But that's sort of more to help Israel's herd immunity since they're going to be in the country. So if they have the disease, it's going to affect the situation in Israel. In terms of Gaza,
and also to help these workers and ensure that they can participate in the Israeli economy, since they can't get that, they won't be able to get that
Exactly.
green passport where they live.
Exactly. But at the end of the day, it's to help Israel more than it is to help the West Bank, I would say. And then in terms of Gaza, they just approved a shipment of 1,000 Russian vaccines to Gaza yesterday, which is not very many. So I think it'll be quite a bit more time until the Palestinians are going to be able to be at the same point as us, unfortunately.
So what you're saying is Israel has officially no responsibility for health care in the West Bank and in Gaza, but
Exactly.
Israel still went and offered a while ago to help, and it was refused.
Exactly, yes. I mean, it's unclear on what level they were offering to help. I'm pretty sure Israel wasn't offering to buy vaccines for all the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Let's be realistic.
But perhaps to help coordinate an effort to
Perhaps.
share vaccines that were coming into the country.
Perhaps. And you know what? It still might come to that point because Israel has a ton of vaccines. We not only do we have millions and millions of Pfizer vaccines, but we have a lot of Moderna vaccines that are not being used. They're literally sitting in storage facilities. And nobody knows what's going to happen with them. And a lot of people are saying, why not give them to the Palestinians? What are we going to do with them? So
that's interesting. Why the preference for the Pfizer vaccine over the Moderna vaccine?
So Israel sort of made a deal with Pfizer that in return for giving us a lot of vaccines really quickly, we would report to them on a lot of, the side effects that
Health
were happening.
outcomes. Right.
Exactly. All the results from giving the vaccination so they could, use it as an experiment for the rest of the world. And we're such a small country that I guess you're able to see the results really, really quickly and, know what's going to happen everywhere else.
So these Moderna vaccines, you're saying, are sitting in storage because Pfizer pushed for Israel to use its vaccines so that it could complete a study over.
Exactly. And the government so quickly was talking to Pfizer and Moderna, trying to get as many as they could so quickly. So we got all these vaccines and now we don't know what to do with them.
So there's a possibility those could be used to sell to the West Bank or Gaza to help their
There's a lot of possibilities.
Right. So a fourth Israeli election. Are you fed up of reporting about Israeli elections?
So I'm the most excited person in the whole country for the fourth election because I get to work with CNN, which I'm really excited about. But other than that, yes, it's really exhausting. I mean, how many times can you go through the same thing and have the same outcome? It's insane. Literally, it's insanity.
Is that the projection that this is going to be another election that will accomplish very little?
Right now, according to the polls, yes.
Wow. So help us understand. Help us understand why. First of all, why a fourth election is taking place and why the same outcome for the fourth time in a row.
So Netanyahu is facing corruption charges. He's had a lot of issues over the last few years, and Benny Gantz was his biggest challenger. So Netanyahu is the head of the Likud party on the right wing. I don't know how much background everyone that's watching has in Israeli politics, but Benny Gantz formed the Blue and White Party and was his biggest challenger. And Benny Gantz couldn't get enough votes to form a majority coalition in every election. This happened, the same thing in every election. So the president let Netanyahu form the coalition and form the government rather than Benny Gantz. So every election we have this outcome where, Netanyahu and Gantz sort of tie, and then we wait to see who the president is going to appoint to try to form a coalition, and it always ends up being Bibi, Netanyahu. So at the end of the day, we wait and we wait and we wait, and we think maybe somebody else finally won the election, and then it ends up being Netanyahu every single time. This time, it's going to be a little bit different because it's not going to be between Netanyahu and Gantz, because Gantz, during Corona, he split from his partners, from other parties, his other center and left-wing partners, and now he's alone. He has a much smaller party and a lot less support. And now I would say Netanyahu's
What was the
biggest,
reason for his? What was the reason he left?
that he split from
Yeah.
Yair Lapid, and because he decided to go with Netanyahu. Because when everything was going crazy with Corona, there was no government, because the election didn't have a result, and the government needed to come up with a budget. And at the end of the day, everyone was pushing to go to another election right away. And Gantz decided that he was going to say, you know what, we can't pay for another election. We have a pandemic. I'm going to agree with Netanyahu. We're going to create this budget, and we're going to have a temporary government and postpone the next election. So because he sided with Netanyahu, all of his partners sort of abandoned him. And I'm sorry to say, but he's become kind of the laughing stock of politics of this country.
Really, Benny Gantz, eh?
Yeah, which is
Was
very
almost
sad.
prime minister.
Right now he's the alternate prime minister, which
Right.
will never get to actually be the prime minister. But yeah, it's really disappointing. So now everybody's sort of looking for that next candidate that's gonna get the country out of all this corruption and out of this mess, and be a new leader that's a little bit more refreshing than Netanyahu, who has been in power for such a long time.
So who is that person?
So
Who is the alternative?
So Gideon Sa'ar was an ally of Netanyahu, and he left the Likud party to start his own party. So his party is Tikva Hadasha, New Hope. Everyone's calling them the Likud alternative, but right now, according to the polls, he's not quite there yet. But there's still time until the election, so a lot could happen. The other sort of alternate is Naftali Bennett. He's a little bit more right-wing, but very young and charismatic, and a lot of the sort of nationalist religious communities love him, and think he could be like a new voice for like the Zionist movement of the country. But again, right now, Netanyahu's winning in the polls, so a bit longer, and then we'll have a clearer idea maybe of what the outcome will be, hopefully different than the last one.
So if I'm not mistaken, the pandemic has created even more frustration among Israelis about Netanyahu. There have been major, major protests all over the country. And yet you're telling us he's likely to be, right now, looks like he's going to win even a fourth election. How has he held on to the support of his base for so long?
So yeah, he has a very, very, very strong base. In fact, there are entire communities that have been voting for him for years and years and years. And although you might see these protests every week, every Saturday night outside his residence of all these, anti-Netanyahu protesters, his base is way stronger than that. It's just like you might have thought that all of the US was like against Trump. Nobody wanted him there. People came out to protest against him. But at the end of the day, look at his supporters. Look how strong they are. They will do anything for him. And just because they're not showing their face on the street, it doesn't mean they're not going to the, voting booths and voting for him.
I know your job is to be a reporter and to remain objective. What are your thoughts about Netanyahu winning this fourth election? Is it good for Israel?
So I think that Netanyahu has accomplished a lot during Corona. During COVID-19, Corona, as we call it in Israel. I mean,
you say accomplished, is that a compliment? Accomplished a lot of good things?
I mean it as a compliment. I mean that we were like one of the first countries in the world to go into lockdown. Like, we acted fast. We're leading the world vaccine campaign. Like, he has pulled all the international strings to make sure that we are leading the whole world in this pandemic, which has definitely helped him and made a lot of people forget about all the charges against him, which is a big issue. But sorry, what was the next part of your question?
Well,
You lost my
that's
train of
just an
thought.
interesting point
Yeah,
itself. If it's going to motivate people's votes in this next election, which will probably be true in
Absolutely.
many countries, is the success of the government in acquiring vaccine and getting the vaccines and getting the pandemic under control. And Netanyahu, no matter what you think of him, you're saying, according to Israelis, did a decent job,
Yeah.
more than decent job at handling the pandemic, and that's going to influence people to vote for him again. But my question
Absolutely.
was, is his reelection good? You're allowed to take the fifth here, but do you think his election is good for the country? His reelection?
I was avoiding the opinion part of the question. So in short, no, I don't think it's a good thing for the country. I think that we've been in a big mess for many years, and the only way to stop this cycle is to have new leadership. I mean,
a mess in what regard?
A mess in terms of there being a corruption case against the prime minister, a mess in terms of there being this massive protest movement against the prime minister, a mess in terms of the prime minister needing to please, the ultra-Orthodox parties, so not stopping these really dangerous events from happening. There's a lot of things that are happening that are messy in the government, and we need a fresh voice in there, somebody who's not as tainted by politics, somebody who's not been doing it for such a long time, to really bring a new voice to the government that's going to represent a different not a different part of the society, but it's going to bring a new message to the country.
So for you, the challenge with Netanyahu is his tactics. It's divide and conquer. He's a divisive figure, and everybody knows that. And the corruption that he's been accused of challenges the democratic and law-abiding character of the country. And a lot of Israelis,
Absolutely.
you say, that poses to a lot of Israelis, that poses a fundamental challenge. And in your opinion, that's not good for the country.
Absolutely. And, there's a lot of people, like I said, who are very loyal to this party, Likud, and not necessarily specifically Netanyahu, or they sort of became loyal to Netanyahu because of this party. And it's a party their family's been voting for generations. And now, after 3 elections, is the first time I'm hearing people say, maybe this time I'm not going to vote for Netanyahu. Or this is a funny one, I'm voting for Likud, not for Netanyahu. But people are sort of getting less comfortable with the idea of cozying up to him, let's say.
So you're hearing it, but those sentiments are not being translated to the polls. The polls still show broad-based support. Is there a sense that all these elections are, I hope there's a sense that it's enough with these elections and it's time to get on with the business of governing the country?
Well, absolutely. But how can you get on with the business of governing the country if there is no functioning government? At the end of the day, people are saying, well, we can't afford another election, but the only way to pass a proper budget to make the country function is to actually go ahead with the election and have some sort of a normal government. So it's just a vicious cycle that is ongoing. And the only way to break free from the cycle is to elect a non-corrupt government.
Okay. Well, we will see. When is the date of the election?
March 23rd.
March 23rd. So we're a month away. Maybe we'll have you back again. Oh, you'll probably be a bit busy.
I'll come on the day after.
So we should watch you on CNN to get up-to-date reporting on what's going on in the elections towards the end of March. Just before we get to questions, I want to mention the Abraham Accords and get your sense of whether that presents the opportunities that presents to Israel nowadays. What's your feeling? Is this old news already, the Abraham Accords, or do you still feel the excitement on the ground?
This story's a bit old, but I don't think the excitement has died out. I think that every Israeli really, really wants to go to Dubai as soon as they can. I think this whole agreement has really allowed The idea of an Arab country and Arabs in general to be really, like, no pun intended, normalized for the people who are now being exposed to it. Because Israelis in the past were afraid of visiting places like this, thought that their lives would be in danger if they were going to go to an Arab country. And it changes the whole dynamic and the whole rhetoric around, how Israelis feel in the Arab world, which is really, really, really important for what's going on here at the end of the day. I think that everyone's really excited about it. And I think that it's one really positive thing that Trump did during his presidency that honestly has changed the dynamic of the Middle East.
Do you feel the journalistic reporting on the Abraham Accords was adequate and fair? Something I'm hearing a lot from people is that this tremendous breakthrough, which presents so many opportunities for understanding and reconciliation between peoples, hardly got any good press, probably because of the president of the United States who was involved and the press's feeling about him.
Sure. So another part of that story is that, as great as it is for Israel, the Palestinians felt like they were really left behind in that deal. They really felt like nobody was worrying about their needs and their problems, but only with Israel, when at the end of the day, the Palestinians really felt like the Arab countries should be asking them what they want and supporting them and making sure they're okay before making a deal like this. So a lot of Palestinians felt like they were left out of it. And because of that, that media coverage existed. I think that people are becoming a lot more used to the idea and understand that the Abraham Accords aren't going anywhere. And all it's going to do is create positive change.
Okay.
And I think that even the Arabs and the Palestinians are really, really starting it to see that way, that this could, I did a really interesting interview with an expert on this exact thing last week, who said that the Abraham Accords might be like an unusual backdoor to some sort of normalization or peace with the Palestinians. So we'll see where it goes from here.
In what sense? Because it shows Palestinians that peace with the Jews is a possibility.
Not only that, but now these countries that are, their brothers also have good relations with Israel, and now can be that connector between the two. Now can say, you're my friend also. Yeah. Let's figure out a way to do this together. Because
one
at the
would have
beginning,
thought that
was the
happened
intention.
with Jordan or with Egypt, right? Decades ago. But who knows? We'll take any opportunity we can to bring the peace process
definitely
forward.
But also, on the ground, in terms of the people, it's a different story if you go to Jordan and if you go to Egypt and say you're an Israeli. If you go to Dubai and you say you're an Israeli, everybody wants to be your friend. It's a different kind of peace.
Right. They say it's a warm peace.
It's a warm peace, exactly.
And just before we go to questions, let's just talk about the peace process for a second. And as I say that, I'm realizing, well, the peace process used to be number one on the agenda whenever you talked with any journalist from Israel. It's now the last question I ask in the program. Is there a reason for that? Do you think that the peace process, it's just time to put that on the back burner? There's too much going on in the region and in the country right now to be advancing peace? Or do you think that new windows and new opportunities are presenting themselves, maybe with the Biden administration?
I think that Donald Trump put it on the back burner, which is why the rest of the world put it on the back burner. I think that he, on the one hand, he was pushing his plan for peace and prosperity, but at the end of the day, it was a really unrealistic plan that everybody sort of decided this is not something we're going to touch. I think now that Biden is back in the White House, I think that it is a great opportunity to progress peace and to start talking again, start negotiations. Biden is already in contact with Palestinian negotiators, after Trump cut off touch with them a long time ago. So I think that we're going to start moving in the right direction now. I think that everyone is too concerned with the pandemic and other issues that are happening to really focus on that. But I do believe during Biden's presidency, this will be a big issue.
Okay, very interesting. I could keep talking with you, Lauren, for a long time. I've already exceeded the 40 minutes that I wanted to speak to you.
We can
because
continue
there's
this
so
later.
much, right? There's so much, and that just shows us why you must love reporting from Israel. There's I can't imagine anywhere in the world that has so many active, interesting, complicated stories that are that are developing on a real-time basis as quickly as they are in Israel. So I'm going to turn it over to Gail now, who I hope can collect some of the questions that we've been receiving throughout this interview, and maybe add some richness to this conversation with some questions from the audience.
I was wondering if you could address the Iran nuclear deal and what Israelis are thinking with regards to Biden maybe opening up negotiations with Iran.
So generally, I guess you all know how much Israelis loved Trump and how pro-Israel Trump was. So Biden was a little bit of a tough pill to swallow when he was elected for Israelis because of how much Trump did for Israel, how much policy he passed for Israel. I think that, you know, the general feeling in Israel among Israelis is that the US shouldn't go back to the nuclear deal, that it's going to hurt Israel in the end, that it's going to allow Iran to do whatever they want and develop a nuclear weapon in general. Again, most of this country is voting for Netanyahu. So just to give you an idea of where people's heads are at. But it depends where you go. You know, it depends who you ask. It depends what area of the country you're in, what kind of demographic you find yourself in. For all of you that have been to Israel, there's a little bit of everything here. So if you ask Israelis, what did they say? 2 Israelis, 3 opinions, or 2 Jews, 3 opinions, something like that. You'll never find a lack of opinions or perspectives coming from Israelis. But generally speaking, I would say that they are against the US talking to Iran and going back to that deal.
Okay, there was also a question about the Labor Party. Is the Labor, I guess the Labor Party is getting some interest. Do you see a coalition with the Labor Party? And do you even see a coalition with including Arabs?
I mean, that's possible. Everything is, like I said, everything is up in the air until the election, right? Anybody can form a coalition. There's no new parties coming out now. They've passed the deadline for that. But usually, you know, from my experience in the last 3 elections, the most interesting alliances are formed just ahead of the elections. So I would say it's irresponsible for me to speculate because it's literally anyone's guess what is going to happen until then. But it's possible, of course, that they're going to have a party with the Arabs, some kind of coalition with the Arabs. We'll have to wait and see.
And I'm going to combine 2 questions. Can you tell us, I guess, about the mask usage in Israel? Is that been politicized like it has been in the US or sometimes even in Canada? And do you also see tourism rebounding in the near future?
So
is there still quarantine? Is there a quarantine in Israel?
Yeah, of course. Masks, generally, everybody wears masks here. There aren't people that really oppose wearing masks, except like we said before, in maybe like the more uneducated communities, they would not wear masks just because they are told not to, or they don't understand why it's helping them. But generally, if you walk down the street, everyone's wearing masks. And in a lot of areas, you know, there's police giving tickets to people who aren't wearing masks. It's generally acceptable that everybody needs to wear a mask to protect themselves and to protect everyone else. In terms of travel, that was the second part of that question, right? Israel just made a deal with Greece that if you have a green passport, you can go and vacation in Greece without quarantine, of course, and do anything you want. But I do, like, the airport in Israel is still going to be essentially shut for another couple of weeks. There are still rescue flights coming in, bringing Israelis from all over the world. But in terms of real travel, that's a whole different animal, because I think that until most of the world is vaccinated, we're not going to be able to travel between countries like we're used to. Unfortunately, because I'm dying to come to Canada to visit my family. Hi, everyone in my family that's watching. But who knows? Who knows how long it's going to be? We're on the way to having most of our population vaccinated. But like I said, until the entire world is in the same place as us, who knows what will happen?
Rabbi, that's it for now.
Well, I saw an interesting question. Someone
Yes.
asked, when is tourism gonna open up again? When are we gonna be able to visit?
In Israel?
Yeah, it's your guess.
Well, first let's open up the airport, which is supposed to happen March 6th, I believe. And then we need to start opening up all the hotels and all the tourism in the country until we can actually bring you here and let you enjoy it. But
And
I don't
does
know.
Israel really want foreigners coming in at this point?
Israel loves tourism. It's a big part of our economy. But if people are bringing in weird mutations from, places that we've never seen before, it's going to really ruin our entire vaccine effort. It's going to ruin our leading the world in the vaccines and coming out of this. So we have to find some sort of happy medium. I think tourism will still have to wait a little longer. First, let people start to be able to have weddings and live their lives before we can have vacations. Well,
I know a certain taxi driver we can ask in near Ben Gurion Airport. He'll know the answer. Lauren,
can you send me his number?
Sure. Lauren, thank you so much for giving us your time, your wisdom, your insights today. It was such a refreshing, nice opportunity to speak to you and get your sense of everything that's going on in Israel. And during this discussion, I know and I hope everybody else felt much more connected to the Jewish homeland, proud of so much that's going on there. And we're feeling obviously also very proud to have you, our native Torontonian, reporting, and I think doing a fantastic job. You all can see Lauren, by the way, if you go on YouTube, if you want to just type in her name, you can see what a great reporter she is, how comfortable she is in front of the camera. So I wish you only blessings and success in the industry. May you go forward with strength, defending the Jewish state, and of course, reporting accurately too. That's important. But
thank you so much.
It's good to have you. It's good to have a friend who's reporting on these issues. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you,
really
Lauren.
A pleasure talking to you guys. Thank you so much. And I really hope that all of you can get vaccinated really soon.
I'll send you the address of our synagogue. If you could send a few of those Moderna ones over, we'll take them. No problem.
Hold on. Let me just call BB.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.